We looked in the last video at two quite stark stereotypes. You know, as you do with a scientific study, you get the extremes of your axis or continuum, and then you can look at them from the most stark areas possible and work from them. So we had Arnold Schwarzenegger, a male and a very masculine male. At the opposite end, I thought of a Disney princess. I think I went for Snow White, or was it Princess Aurora? And a very female, feminine. So those are our two extremes. And because, as I posit, there's an orchestrated polarization of these two extremes. My mum made the interesting point, and I think I agree with her, that there is, an area in the middle that is now beginning to increasingly get filled, although perhaps not with anything particularly as clear and as boundaried and as concrete as the two extremes of my stereotypes. But perhaps because of the separation aspect, there is that gap in the middle, in between, for new models, in inverted commas, to arrive. But we're gonna stick with our extremes for the moment, with our polarized masculine, feminine examples. And there's an interesting writer, Brené Brown from the States, and she talks a lot about shame. And in order for us to look at this, we need to introduce the concept of identity politics. Now, identity politics is where you externalize who you are, your identity. So that can happen with race is an obvious one, nationality, color, creed, politics, socio-dynamics through economics, the class war, this sort of thing. You can look at fashions, some people wear that, some people wear that, and that creates a sort of clique cult. Sports teams is a very pronounced one. But gender is probably the first one. An interesting study I once looked at, where children are aware of the idea of gender at a very early age. I think it was around 2-3 years old. And so at a very deep level, at a very core level, we consider ourselves to be male or female, as opposed to a human. And you can argue that it's mostly irrelevant until teenagers' years, whatever. But yet we still very much group ourselves in terms of gender and sexuality as in gender, anatomical differences. And Brené Brown looks at how those two identity politics grow and develop and progress through into adulthood. And it gets very interesting because there are cultural priorities that are passively but very powerfully instilled into males and females that create pressure to fit in and conform. I think we have to get to a very primal stage when we talk about fitting in and conforming. The opposite of fitting in and conforming is the very powerful emotion of shame. And so Brené Brown looks often at how that emotion of shame is manifest in terms of characteristics and behavior. So let's dig into what the research shows that are the norms to conform to. And she concludes that for women, it's very much appearance-based. To be thin, to use all resources in pursuit of appearance. Those are two actual quotes from her. To be nice, to be modest. Very passive characteristics, very genteel, withering characteristics that we'll get into the characteristics of femininity as opposed to the anatomical, physical differences with being a female. But if femininity is receptive, then interestingly, the priorities that we put onto girls and women are passive. They're non-confrontational, non-assertive. All the masculine traits aren't in this list for women. And when I say we put pressure on women, I don't mean men. I mean culturally, and this is what these videos are about: is trying to reduce the separation between men and female. Because actually, I think it would be fair to argue. Feel free to contest this in the comments, that some of the biggest pressures on women come from females in terms of appearance and this sort of thing. And so this sort of Snow White, genteel, passive, modest, small and quiet, stay small, stay quiet, these pressures on women create a restriction in their expression, because those opposite masculine energies that women are entitled to have, just as men are entitled to have feminine energies and attitudes and characteristics, these restricted sort of emotional zones, metaphysical areas, spheres, are very important. Moving to a sort of scientific area, if you think of a circuit board where a current moves around a circuit, it needs both input and output. Let's say you have a bulb on your circuit board, and it has two pins, and one of the pins inputs and goes up, lights up the bulb, and then the current leaves, exits, outputs. Well, if only half of those characteristics, input and output, are operational, then you're going to have a problem. So what we're saying is that the pressures we put on women are that they can receive, which is very feminine, but they can't express. They are culturally and psychologically restricted from access to, permission to express everything. They might be allowed to express beauty, or they might be allowed to express modesty and this kind of thing, but there are masculine traits that we'll get to in a minute that females are, from a very early age, culturally restricted from expressing. For example, anger. It is non-ladylike to be angry. And then flipping it around to the opposite, we have the Arnold Schwarzenegger stereotype. This doesn't necessarily have to be muscles and weapons. That characteristic of all-knowing, all-powerful could manifest itself in terms of academic education, or sense of humor, even, or social prowess, sexual prowess, whatever it might be. There's a cultural requirement or priority for men that's instilled into them from an early age in their childhood, to show no weakness. This is Brené Brown's quote: "Men must show no weakness or suffer the consequences of that very powerful emotion of shame." And then shame comes with fitting into the community and the tribe, and exile from the tribe could mean death. So the shame is very much connected with acceptance in a tribe, and we are very community-based tribal species. So you flip that around, and if the male cultural priority is showing no weakness, then similarly with the female problem, there is a restriction in the flow of the circuitry. So men are able to access those emotions that we said females aren't, such as anger, because there's a certain belief concept that anger is a sort of strong emotion. So she makes some interesting examples. Brené Brown makes some interesting examples about watching her young son in a sports practice where, adult fathers are projecting their own egos through these kids. Hit the ball, hit the ball, hit the ball, come on, don't cry, and these kids are swinging and spinning like spinning tops and, putting everything they've got into succeeding and achieving what the goal is. Very masculine characteristic is to do something, quest, adventure, express. And so to succeed in something like hitting a ball, baseball, I think the sport is instilled into these children is highly important. It's there's very little room for leeway and maneuver. This is what must be done, otherwise it's a failure, and the failure leads to the sense of shame, because the male priority, as we've established, is show no weakness. And so this whole kind of pecking order, sort of stags at springtime, frisky stags at springtime, competing with each other, this sort of zone of life is magnified and expanded upon to the nth degree, so that men can feel good about themselves. The flip side is Brené Brown's daughter, is playing a bit of soccer, and it's completely different. Oh, that's fine, don't worry about it. You look beautiful. The competition and the sort of the winning and the succeeding is not nearly as culturally important for the little girls as it is for the little boys. And so here we have this polarization of masculinity and femininity instilled into children from a very, very early age. And this is a really important benchmark foundation place from which to build into part 3.